Welcome everyone to the CrySP speaker series on privacy. CrySP, of course, is the Cryptography, Security and Privacy group in the Cheriton School of Computer Science here at the University of Waterloo, but today's talk is also co-hosted by the Librarians and Archivists Association of the University of Waterloo. So it's a great pleasure today to have Sarah Lamdan. Sarah Lamdan is a professor at CUNY School of Law. She researches and writes about information access, surveillance and privacy, and informational capitalism, topics very relevant to our speaker series. So I will turn it over to Sarah, and please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and thank you to Ian and Jordan Hale and everybody who's made this talk possible and really helped organize everything. Yeah, and for everybody who's showing up despite all of the snow that I have heard has fallen in your neck of the woods. So yeah, as Ian mentioned, I'm going to be talking about data analytics companies. And the reason I'm talking about data analytics companies in part is because I wrote a book that's going to be published this year called Data Cartel. And the book really dives into data analytics companies and their monopolization of multiple information markets and kind of how that impacts privacy and information access, and really the whole knowledge enterprise and critical essential information access, and then personal privacy, which is what I'll focus on in the latter part of today's talk. So the key things I'm going to cover in the next, 45 minutes or so, we're going to leave time for questions. You can feel free to post questions in the Q&A too. We'll be keeping track of that. Actually, while I'm thinking about, I'm putting it over to the side of the screen so I can see it too. So the next slide, yeah. So here are the three kind of things I'll be focusing on during our time together today. So first, I'm going to go over a little bit of what data analytics companies are and why they should matter to us as academics and just as people living on the earth. Like why should we care about data analytics companies? And then I'm going to discuss a little bit of kind of what they're doing currently, like the status quo. They're not very thoroughly regulated, especially in the US, but also in Canada. There's not a lot of extensive data analytics regulations. So kind of what the status quo allows them to do with our data, with all of the data and information products they collect. And then I'm going to talk about why we care. Hopefully we'll already care before we get to that part of the talk, but that part of the talk, I'm really going to focus in on the privacy implications and what these companies are doing with our personal with our personal data and why that should matter to us. So let's start with the first bullet point. What are data analytics companies? So this is just like the Wikipedia definition of data analytics, right? Data analytics is a process of inspecting, cleaning, transforming, and modeling data with the goal of discovering useful information, informing conclusions, and supporting decision-making. So data analytics is really like whenever we talk about the use of algorithms, the use of machine learning, the use of AI, whatever we think of AI, if we think it's a real thing or kind of a fun computer science tech term that is made up, that's a whole different talk. But all of those things, machine learning, AI, algorithmic use, predictive algorithms, just sorting algorithms, what have you, that is all data analysis, right? It's all taking data, sorting it, making kind of judgments about it, structuring it into information, as I'll describe in a few minutes. And data analytics has multiple facets and approaches. So there are a lot of reasons that companies use data analytics. There are a lot of reasons that companies develop data analytics systems. I'm sure you can already think of a bunch, right? As we're even just sitting here mentioning the term. So data analytics have a variety of names, both the processes and the outcomes, right? There's predictive analytics, there's sorting, there's hot lists, sorting lists, search results, what have you. Like those are all different kind of data analysis, right? And they're used in all sorts of different kind of areas of our lives these days. And I kept the second paragraph in because I like the last sentence. In today's business world, data analysis plays a role in making decisions more scientific and helping businesses operate more effectively. That's super like fun neoliberal speak, pro data analysis. And I'm not like, I don't believe that all data analytics are harmful, and I don't believe that, you know, data use is inherently harmful. This is a lot of this talk is kind of about the way data analytics companies the way they're docents of our data and the way they care for our data and curate our data. I don't think that those processes have to be that are harmful, but I think that oftentimes, as you'll see, when they're done for profit, the idea of putting profit before kind of people and ethics is problematic, and that comes up a lot. So some concrete examples of data analytics companies that when I think of data analytics companies, I think of companies like General Electric, Tesla, phone companies, right? Pretty much any company that operates right now is, if they haven't already, is transforming into a company that collects and monetizes and uses our data, whether it's internally to increase profits, to target ads, or to, kind of scope out what their customer base is interested in, or whether they are reselling and repackaging data. So the companies that I focus on are major companies that do the latter. They restructure our data and information, and they resell it. So when I think of data analytics companies, my focus goes to companies like Thomson Reuters, Canadian company, Elsevier, LexisNexis, which are actually the same company, Relics, or read Elsevier, LexisNexis. I think of companies like Clarivate, ProQuest. And one thing all of these companies have in common is that they're all very, very central to the current kind of academic and knowledge enterprise. We use them a lot in our universities and colleges, and as we learn and intake information. So here, now that we kind of know what data analytics companies are, here are some examples of the kind of analytics products that these companies make, right? Academic metrics, right? That is a data analytics product that these companies create and resell using data analytics. So they gather information about what academic articles get clicked on, where people, who write the articles go to school and who they're collaborating with, all sorts of metrics and data points about academic research and work and preprints and where things get published. And they create predictions and metrics about how certain academic projects will perform, whether they'll be successful, whether they'll be lucrative, right? And they sell those to academic institutions who are deciding tenure and deciding who to hire and which labs to install in their schools. They also sell that to grant funders and people who support academic research. And then they also sell it to like pharmaceutical companies and tech companies as a means to predict what those companies should be buying and investing in and looking out for, right, on the marketplace as a result of research that academics are doing. So that's one type. There's also, there are these kind of useful data analytics like COVID-19 projections and other kind of public health projections. Those are, while they're not necessarily, exploited in the same way, those are also data analytics. So it's important for me to kind of list, not just what I think are the problematic data analytics uses, but also more generally. So that kind of material. And remember, COVID-19 projections and statistics and metrics are very useful for public health, but there's also a lot of privacy concerns around those, right? How we're collecting data about how COVID-19 is spreading. There are a lot of concerns internationally about collecting people's personal data and re-identifying that personal data. And some of the fears about COVID-19 data and data analytics are coming to pass in some countries where that kind of data is being sold to like law enforcement or being used in ways that are mission creep or go beyond, the mission for which they were collected, right? So we also have stock market predictions. Those, can be data analytics. Whoever has the access to the best information wins, wins the money, right? A really nice way to ensure that wealthy people get better access to information and maintain and protect their own wealth and wall that off. You see that all the time in, like, when you look at Bloomberg terminals and finance firms that can afford really, really expensive data products, right? They benefit from data analytics that most of us can't access. There's also, in the policing context, kind of an explosive growth in use and purchase of data analytics products. Predictive policing developing hot lists of places to scope out and surveil and people to follow, identifying who may or may not commit a crime based on who they're associated with and where they are, tracking people's license plates and making assumptions about where they've been, where they're going. So there's a lot of analytics that are being used in kind of surveillance and law enforcement context too. So these are just some examples. This is not an exhaustive list at all. I just wanted to give kind of an array of examples. So we know what some data analytics companies are, and we know what some examples of their products are. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about how the companies, read Elsevier, Lexis, Nexus, or Thomson Reuters, or Clarivate, Palantir, all these companies, how do they make these kind of predictions out of data? So the first thing I want to point out is that data and information aren't the same thing. So we use those terms interchangeably a lot. Like, I'll admit, when I first started researching these companies, I came at it from a perspective of astonishment, because I had just learned that LexisNexis was helping to or vying to participate in ICE surveillance programs. And so I kind of came at it from just a place of concern and curiosity. And I wasn't as familiar with, the specific terms and kind of how important it is to be very deliberate about what terms we use in this context. So now I share what I've learned so that other people don't make the same mistake. But information and data are different, right? And it might not matter in some contexts, but when you think about commercial value and buying and selling of what kind of products we're developing, it matters, right? Data is generally unstructured information. So data is like, like the dog on the left, just random information that's kind of swirling around. So data points about me. My name is Sarah. I am a professor. I study law. The street that my school is on is Court Square. The building number is 2. The area code for my institution is 314, right? All of those data bits are just kind of floating around. Information is structured data. So when I take that information, I say, okay, Professor Sarah Lamdan works at CUNY School of Law, 2 Court Square, Long Island City, New York. That's structured data or structured information. It's taking those loose bits of data that have been collected, from whatever ephemeral online places, and it structures them into something meaningful and operable. You can call me, you can reach me, you know who I am, you know what I do, right? So it's information that's much, it's data that's been organized and structured. So the data analytics process makes data into structured, usable information, right? So here's how companies use data analytics. I'm sorry, I'll read it to you because I know it's not necessarily the clearest, but I just really love this visualization because I think it's useful. So this is actually the first time I saw this pyramid was in Clarivate's 10K, its annual report in US. And this is how Clarivate, which is an academic metrics company that sells structured data to pharmaceutical companies, to institutions, academic institutions, etc. This is how they describe what they do with data, and they call it the data business value pyramid. So you see at the bottom, the lowest bar, like the most, the least valuable, but the biggest bar is raw data assets. So that's just that floating data, it's data that they've managed to gather. They've collected, they're warehousing it, they're storing it somewhere. right? So the second level is smart data. And so they take that raw data and they organize it, right? Okay, here's data about, you know, where people live. Here's data about, I don't know, like weather patterns in Waterloo, right? So they take just all this data and they start to organize it. They standardize it. They make it so that, you know, it can work together and play together in the same analytics systems and the same algorithms or whatever, that it can interact, right? So they tidy it up. The next level, they platform it, and they build applications that use it. So they make it usable, right? In a way that we can search in their platform, in their system, usually like a walled garden system where we pay a subscription fee and we can, you know, hang out and see what they have. Yeah, they have, like, you know, they can make data visualizations and search mapping, stuff like that. So the real value, I think, that these companies are really working to build, because it's the top two layers are kind of the most sophisticated and unique forms of data that these companies can collect. They're hardest for other companies to duplicate, and they're the most valuable, right? The gray bar, one step down from the pinnacle, is predictive analytics. So then they take the data that they've organized and that they've structured, and they run it through predictive data analytics system, and they make predictions, right? This stock is most likely to succeed. This project is most likely to be lucrative. You are most likely to win your legal case if you file in this court with this judge, right? This person's most likely to commit a crime, right? So they build predictive analytics and they sell predictions to law enforcement, lawyers, academic institutions, healthcare system, landlords. We'll see some more examples kind of towards the end of the talk. So that's predictive analytics. And then the very top layer is prescriptive analytics, where they outright tell these entities what to do based on what the data says. So that's just like one step further for making a prediction, giving, you know, the best advice to these companies, public institutions, whoever they're selling it to, right? So that's how the companies use and market their data analytics service. That's what they claim to be selling to the public. So this looks fancy and it sounds amazing, right? Like, oh my gosh, data can predict, you know, what stock is going to make me a business tycoon. Wow, that's cool. Like, if you're a law enforcement officer, wow, I know exactly who to arrest by clicking this button. That's amazing. But when you look at the back end of what these companies do, it's not as sophisticated as these pyramids make it look. It's kind of like the idea of AI being smoke and mirrors. The idea that these data analytics pyramid, the data is just being structured and organized just so, that's not necessarily the case. What I think it is more like is it's a little more rudimentary. It's the idea that these companies are taking a slurry of personal data and then also a slurry of other structured information like case law or, you know, academic metrics, scientific studies, whatever kind of information collections that they have. And they're running that slurry of personal data through analytic systems with the other structured information that they have, with other informational content, like one of those Play-Doh extruders, right? So they're taking all of these data assets that they own and they're squishing them through the top, and they're like, what? And then what comes out at the end is just this blended, you know, spaghetti or tube of information. And then that's what they're selling. That's their byproduct, right? They're selling this informational byproduct that they've run through analytic software to the public. And we all, I mean, I don't want to make assumptions, but since we're all kind of information people, we're all information science, either in it or information science adjacent. We've probably read a lot about how algorithms are problematic, they're imperfect, they're biased often. Data definitely suffers the same problem. So data collected by public institutions is disproportionately collected for people who rely more on government services, and then also people who have more police interaction. So that tends to be data that is biased and weighed against communities that are highly surveilled, oftentimes like people of color, people who might depend on government services more, right? So the combination of kind of biased algorithms and problematic algorithms, and then kind of sloppy and biased data sets means that running, the sloppy data through the sloppy algorithms doesn't necessarily make this like these beautiful, perfect predictions and prescriptions. But that doesn't stop the companies from advertising them and selling them like they are doing these things. So to get to a place where a company can have its little information extruder going, they have tons of materials to squish through and did their data software. They need a lot of data. So the reason that companies like Thomson Reuters and Reed Elsevier Lexis are able to become such powerful data analytics companies is because they own the lion's share of informational assets, of critical information assets, in the United States for sure, and also in other countries, like for instance, Canada. But there are other, data analytics companies that operate in other places. But the main ones that I tend to focus on are Reed Elsevier LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters. Each of these markets has a couple of other players like financial data. There's, also Bloomberg LP and Experian and some other operators. In commercial data, obviously there's like Axiom, and in news, like Thomson Reuters isn't the only game in town. There are other, news companies, but generally there are no other companies that are part of monopolies, duopolies, or oligopolies in all of these markets. However, Thomson Reuters and Reed Elsevier LexisNexis are, which is pretty remarkable, I think. So the reason that RELX and Thomson Reuters and companies like them, although I don't know anywhere as big as them, are able to be so powerful at data analytics is they have huge stores of personal information, academic research. Elsevier is one of the top, is the top academic journal publishers, content providers in the world. So they have a huge amount of academic information assets and resources. They are a duopoly for legal information. So they have the leading legal research products and legal information products that contain all of our case law, all of our statutes, regulations, etc. Like they have all that informational content, right? All this knowledge about what judges are doing, what terms are the most popular in court opinions, things like that, right? They have a huge amount of financial data, and I'm not talking about like credit scores and stuff. I actually categorize that as a variety of personal information. So your personal financial data is personal information in this kind of grid. But when I talk about financial data, I'm talking about like stock data and data about corporate governance structures and data about corporations and companies that they can use to make financial predictive data analytics. Until recently, Thomson Reuters Refinitiv was kind of in a financial data duopoly with Bloomberg LP. It's interesting because they've just shifted that resource to, I think, the London Stock Exchange, but that doesn't change the fact that these companies have huge financial data assets and they're well structured and well organized. They also have gigantic personal information dossiers. This is something that people don't often know about Thomson Reuters and Reed Elsevier LexisNexis. They are some of the biggest government and insurance company and risk data brokers in the personal information sector. They get personal information about all of us from over 10,000 sources updated in real time. And there are just not that many personal data companies that are quite as big as Relics and Thomson Reuters. And they also have huge news archives. LexisNexis has a famously gigantic news archive. Thomson Reuters runs its own news service, right? Reuters News. So they have a huge amount of news information. And they can take all of these informational assets, they can sell them separately. They can sell legal information platforms. They can sell their Elsevier journals. They can sell, content to Reuters News or whatever. And they own, like LexisNexis owns American Law Media, or they're affiliated with American Law Media. They can paywall that and so they can make money off of these structured information assets. and then they can also use them in their data analytics products. So they get to double dip. They get to make money from these information portfolios in two ways, right? They get to sell this as like their raw data or raw informational assets, and then they also get to experiment and find out how to monetize these even more by combining them with personal information. And they sell predictions, like they sell legal information predictions. They tell lawyers how to structure their cases, what language to put in their cases, where to file their cases. They sell all sorts of financial data products that help insurers and financial institutions decide how to invest and where the risks are. They sell personal information, data analytics products that I'll describe in a little bit. And they also sell academic metrics like Scopus, and also other information to help academic researchers decide who to publish with, where to publish, who to talk to, where to meet, and all sorts of other academic research metrics and data analytics that I'm sure you've encountered in your work as well. So that's what that red geometric shape is to the right. That's the data analytics products, which is really just all of these products squished together with our personal data. So for perspective, this model of data analytics serves these companies really well. They make a huge amount of money. They make billions of dollars. Some people think of like academic journals as being like mom and pop shops, like, oh yeah, there's a sweet little academic journal, or like Westlaw being like a legal information company that's just publishing cases. That's not the case. Data analytics companies are multi-billion-dollar businesses. They are huge tech corporations. And their profit margins are gigantic. So here, in this one chart, it's really interesting to see Elsevier has higher profit margins than the banking industry, the broadcasting industry, the financial services industry, railroads, investment management, software, real estate, and they also have bigger profit margins than like Facebook and Google and other tech companies. So this begs the question: how do these companies make such huge profit margins? Well, the reason that I think they make such huge profit margins is because they manage to make data analytics products and sell information that they don't pay a lot for, right? The companies actually got to where they were in large part by cornering digital data sets before anybody else digitized them. So like Lexis actually was the first company to start digitizing American law en masse. So they already had like all this case law already digitized by the time that we went online, and hard copies were replaced by digital copies of things. They had that already. And Elsevier is one of the oldest journal companies in the world, and they were also the first to digitize academic research content. So they cornered markets just kind of by being the first to have the data, right? They also cornered the market by appropriating our informational labor. So they, data analytics and personal data collection is extractive. Like we toil away in the online ecosystems that we have to be in, for work or to buy things or to participate, in society. And that data just gets siphoned off to data brokers and kind of makes their way into these companies' data dossiers, oftentimes at a very low cost or just for free, that they can scrape or exchange or what have you, or get from their own walled garden platforms that we have to go on. They also privatize public informational resources. This is actually one of my biggest complaints about the companies. They get resources and they profit for resources that we pay for, right? Most academic research is publicly funded, and that means that we're paying for the resources that they end up profiting on, right? And it's the same with like the law. We pay for for legislature to work, for regulators to work, for the government to work. We pay for law. And then they profit from those things that we pay for. So yeah, of course they make big profit margins. They're just getting, we're paying for the stuff that they're making money from. They also ramp up prices for that information that should be free. One example I put in here is like Relics' Elsevier increased journal prices by 300% in just a few decades, right? So they can charge whatever they want, and they get to charge whatever they want because when you're an information monopoly, that means you have unique information sets that other companies can't access, right? If all this stuff is their proprietary information, that means that if we want that information, if we want the newest COVID study, or if we want case law from a Las Vegas court, we have no choice but to pay these companies to access it, right? So that's like what a monopoly is. It's a situation where we have, as consumers, a lack of choice. And if we want the thing, we have to pay whatever price they put on it, even if it's above market value or above what it should cost. And then what they do with their data analytics products is they take the stuff that they're already making huge profit margins on, and they monetize it even more by finding new ways to make new information sets out of all the information they already have off of the information they've already warehoused. So I compare data companies to other gigantic kind of octopus-like monopolies. There are some monopolies that are just, the reason they're monopolies is just because they're so big and they have so much of the market, right? So these companies are to information what companies like Nestle are to food. So they're these multi-industry behemoth, entities that control broad swaths of resources. With Nestle owns Cheerios, Hot Pockets, Perrier. They own a whole set of food. I have a chart on the next page that I'll show you, but they own tons of food products, and we don't even know. Like you don't even think about Nestle if you're buying a box of Hot Pockets, probably, or a bottle of water. They're bottled water monopolists. So if you're buying a bottle of water, chances are you can route it back to Nestle, and Nestle is getting money from you purchasing that bottle of water. Nestle's products are so varied and ubiquitous that it's really hard to avoid them. Like it's hard to go to the market or to your bodega or to a snack machine and not buy a product that is a Nestle product. Nobody loves Nestle. In fact, a lot of people hate Nestle. Nestle has done a lot of human rights violating things all over the world. Nestle is not a benevolent or a company that most people feel good supporting. And yet we all buy Nestle stuff because we don't have much choice, right? And one author who wrote about academic research made an analogy that I really like. He wrote, if a candy maker decided to charge $5,000 for an organic chocolate bar, consumers wouldn't respond by stealing the bar. They'd simply buy another brand of chocolate, right? Like if you go to a store and there's like a $20 candy bar, you'll just buy the Hershey's bar, the Snickers bar, whatever, right? Like the Cadbury bar that is a price that is reasonable to you. But when a publisher of an academic journal decides to charge $5,000 for a yearly subscription, you'll go ahead and pay that price because it's the only place where you can get those articles and that journal access. There's no other option, right? So that's how food companies work too. And you can see here's like Kellogg, General Mills, PepsiCo. You see Nestle in the bottom left-hand corners. Like they own huge food companies all over the world, and most of our food resources are owned by just a handful of companies. And now it's the same with our informational resources, which as information experts, we should probably be a little bit more concerned about than maybe we are. I would love to make a similar chart like this with information, but I have not been able to do that yet. So if anybody else does it, let me know. So in the olden days, in the US, Standard Oil was like the major company, the major monopolist, an oil monopolist that sparked kind of the whole antitrust movement and antitrust law in the United States. Breaking up big oil was the main, goal of laws like the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, right? Making sure that things like oil and steel and major critical public resources weren't being monopolized and sold at unfair prices. I believe that today, data companies are the new Standard Oil, and that we need to focus more on breaking up those types of monopolies. So really briefly, I want to describe, how we got here. To some of you, this might be completely like you already know this, but a lot of people aren't really familiar with the history of kind of datification and how that impacted data analytics. So I'll go over it for a moment. So in the 1990s, we had kind of an information revolution. Databases actually were invented long before. In like the 60s and the 70s, we started figuring out how to store data and then how to sort data and then how to search data, right? There were different kind of layers. But in the 1990s, we figured out how to start taking data or types of information and consolidating them into like a single disk drive or USB dongle or what have you, right? Suddenly we could take written works like academic journal articles, we could take a Van Gogh painting or some sort of like a photograph of a sculpture, and we could take music, sounds, speeches, and we could file all of those together in the same computer. So the Tolkien's Lord of the Rings could be on the same file as all of Monet's lily pads or whatever, right? They could all be together, and that was a huge revolution for information providers, because all of a sudden publishers and copyright intermediaries like music labels could fit all sorts of different types of media into like a binary code single source space, right? They could store them on a single disk, and that was a huge advantage for companies that had kind of portfolios of copyright assets. I think of them as like looking not at their resources as informational resources, but as looking at them as like dollar signs, right? Like, oh my gosh, I have thousands of academic journals. Now I have every case ever written, and now I have every song, that was sung by this artist. And they could just put it on their copyright portfolio and make tons of money. So they were stoked. And they started warehousing all sorts of data, not even sure how they would use it, right? Like, okay, if we can just start getting people's healthcare files, and we can get information about medicine patents, what can we do with that, right? So they started just warehousing tons of data to think about how they might be able to monetize it. So they started collecting scientific data, our personal data, financial data, legal information, academic research, and they just started collecting as much of it as they could. And publishers got on this bandwagon because it is kind of the wave of the future. Like, it's really, I understand if you're a profit-driven enterprise, you have to go to where the money is and work with that, right? So they stopped going down the road of traditional publishing. We're gonna print case law so that people can read case law, and they started thinking, okay, how are we going to monetize this more though? And they all just veered off the publishing road and became data analytics companies. So in doing so, they also started trying to get as much content and as much data analytics software as possible. And they just started buying up as much as they could. And companies like Relics and Thomson Reuters that already had really robust data collections were in a very good position to make big acquisitions, right? So between 2008 and 2018, so in one decade, Thomson Reuters completed over 200 acquisitions. They bought both informational content and data sources. And then they also bought like data software and data analytics companies. And they also started hiring thousands of technologists. Both Relics and Thomson Reuters have very robust technology labs, which is computer science experts building new algorithms and figuring out how to crunch all the data and information resources they own. So they really transitioned, they really pivoted from publishing to data analytics. We still call them publishers, but they don't call themselves publishers. They call themselves data analytics companies. And you can see here, this is another kind of visualization. This is just Marshall Breeding, is a library expert who just maps out consolidation in library systems platforms. So that's just like how library services are delivered, which has really been taken over by these outside vendors. And you can see like there used to be a bunch of them. And now in 2020, which is on the far left side, it's all Clarivate, and Clarivate just purchased ProQuest, that band at the top. So Clarivate is just a huge data analytics center for academic information that is being collected through library services. So this is happening kind of across the board. And there's this really great report that was written by Alejandro Posada and George Chen from the University of Toronto, Scarborough. I recommend this report. You should go read it. It's great. But not only that, what they found is not only did the companies start kind of acquiring more and more data assets and more and more data analytics software, they also figured out how to monetize more information types. So it used to be that Relic or Elsevier, sorry, or Thomson Reuters, whatever, would only profit at the point of publication. So they would only profit by like selling court reporters or selling an academic journal. These companies figured out how to also monetize and sell data from the research process. So platform and get data from preprints, how many people are clicking on your bpress or SSRN, post, and then also how to monetize what happens after publication. So how many clicks, and this is where academic metrics really happens. How many clicks did your article get? Who is working with who and where are they going? Who's getting grants funded by whom, right? So data analytics and the collection of personal data really allowed them to expand what kinds of data they were collecting. So this is kind of the general map of how the data collection and data monetization was expanded. And here is an overlay with the product names. So you see, most of these products are now owned by Reed, Elsevier, Lexis, Nexus. But you can see a lot of this looks familiar. Like I use SSRN. Oh yeah, I've used, like I get Plum Analytics sometimes on some things that I've published. Like we've all seen these things before. These are all just monetization of the knowledge enterprise. It's pretty amazing. And here's another image that Relics posts to describe itself. I like this one a lot because it looks like a Play-Doh extruder, like it looks like the Play-Doh Fun Factory. You see, they take, on the left side, they take all these different types of data and information assets, public records, primary research, news articles, contributory databases, unstructured and structured records, what have you, like all of their informational content that they have. So the stuff that they've all warehoused, right? And then it goes through this magical extruding process in the middle where the data analytics happen, and it spits out predictive and prescriptive information that they sell, right? Entity resolution, leak analysis, clustering, right? They take all of these different stuff, they run it through analytics software, and then they make completely new information products to sell. And Relics even describes its own business model this way. So it admits that it is transforming what it does from publishing to digital. That's the way to describe it here. They spend over 1.3 billion on technology in this year. I think this is like from 2017 or 2018, and they employ 7,000 technologists at the time, and they're recategorizing themselves from a media group or publisher to being a business services company. And Thomson Reuters is doing the same thing. Clarivate ProQuest is doing the same thing, where they're moving from publishing to business solutions or risk products, right? Prescriptive and predictive materials. So why do we care? Well, one, it's a huge amount of control to exercise over all of our critical information and personal information. It's just tons of data and information that very few companies control, which should concern all of us. And another big problem is that there's decreased quality control. So there are, as the focus on collecting more data and more information and worrying more about analytics goes up, quality control on the data decreases. The companies are so focused on getting more data to crunch and to run through data analytics that they're less concerned with how correct that data is. We've all seen, there's less emphasis and money spent on review processes and vetting processes for the information that they collect. And that means that they platform and sell a lot of erroneous information. And all of this also strips us of informational control, right? We have less control over our personal data. We have less control over the quality and types of essential information that we can access about our laws and about healthcare and science and things that are really important for us as members, as humans and members of society to know. So the two main things that I focus on in my book are how the companies interfere with information access, and then also how they interfere with privacy. And I'm gonna I want to get to the privacy stuff real quick. before we end, because I think that's the most shocking. So these are the four major things that I think that these companies do. They put personal data in places it shouldn't go. They divert data from places it needs to go, like COVID research to healthcare professionals during a pandemic, right? They block data to people who can't afford to pay the paywalls or subscription fees, and they pollute data by mixing low quality data into data sets in order to have more grist for their data analytics tools. So I am going to talk just briefly about what I think is the most dangerous thing these companies do, which is their risk solution products. So these products are the products that they sell to law enforcement, healthcare system, employers, insurance companies, and other entities that make huge decisions about our lives. And they call these products business and risk solutions, but really what they are is predictions about how risky we are that they derive from all sorts of data that they've collected from wherever, right? I call these risk solution products the creepiest data analytics products because they're all about us. Here are some examples of things that LexisNexis says it does in kind of under the umbrella of risk solutions. It collects 37 billion public records and data from 10,000 disparate sources, personal data. They create these things called Lex IDs for all of us. And the way Lex IDs were described to me once was as being like our social security numbers, but a million times more revealing, because basically it's this number that's associated with you that has all of this data in it, like just tons and tons of different types of data. And then they take that Lex ID and they just crunch it through all of their different personal risk products. So the product that they sell to healthcare providers, the product that they sell to law enforcement, like your Lex ID can be is run through all of those and either and categorized, sorted, put on a hot list, put on a risk list, whatever, ranked. So Lex IDs, I think, are pretty problematic, but totally unregulated. They make like alerts and notifications for law enforcement, for insurance companies, what have you, where they might ping you if your Lex ID looks, raises red flags. They also they identify people. So even if you don't want to be identified and you want to remain kind of off the information grid, they will definitively identify you with a click of a button. Visualization and mapping tools, they can show where you are, who you're associated with, and create like a geographical and also kind of visual mapping of who and where you are in the world. They do a lot of major sorting batch processing for healthcare professionals, law enforcement, or healthcare companies, law enforcement, insurance companies, what have you. And they create like these fusion centers in the United States. LexisNexis works with over 1,300 local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, and they create these big pools of data that any of the law enforcement agencies can access. So they help them cooperate. And fusion centers are government sanctioned fusion centers are really controversial. They're like a post-Patriot Act kind of system that is proven to be very problematic. And LexisNexis just kind of sets up third-party private fusion centers totally under the radar without any of that scrutiny. Super cool. I'm just kidding. It's not cool at all. That is me being sarcastic. So here's a little page about kind of what a Lex ID is. So it's your it's an identifier. I don't know if it's like a numeric or alphanumeric, but it's some identifier that represents you, and then it can connect you with all of the data points that are associated with you, and then it can like make associations between you and other nearby Lex IDs, and just do data analytics on them, just sort them and link them, what have you. It's over 283 million unique, and this is only in the US, not even in Canada, unique consumer identities, 78 billion records, and over 10,000 sources of data. And lest you be concerned that maybe being in Canada, you don't have the same kind of Lex ID, Thomson Reuters has an almost identical system called Clear that is born from the same company. So both of these, both Lex ID and Clear, come from ChoicePoint, which was like the grandparent of personal data analytics. Lexis has that company. So Lexis bought the entirety of ChoicePoint, and then the US was like, no, wait, you're going to be a government personal data monopoly. We can't have that. So they intervened and they forced Lexis to divest part of ChoicePoint to Thomson Reuters. So Thomson Reuters has a very similar system with just as much data about you organized probably in a similar way. So while it's not a Lex ID, it's some other identifier. So don't worry, Thomson Reuters has you covered, even if you don't have a Lex ID, which you probably do have a Lex ID. So they're really, really robust. And if you ever want to see, Shay Swager, who's a librarian in the US, actually managed to get his own Thomson Reuters clear dossier. It was over 41 pages long, and it contained errors that he couldn't correct. And the cover page I find really entertaining, because the cover page says, yeah, this data set that we have about you that we sell to law enforcement and healthcare systems and insurers, it might be inaccurate, and we waive our responsibility. You can't fix it through us. And we don't think you should use this in any way that that will harm consumers. But like, that's what you get. You get a cover page saying, hey, don't rely on this landlord, don't rely on this employer, but here's all this information about this person, and it's riddled with errors. So that's cool. There's a lot of really interesting stories, if you want to dive into it, about people who have been unable to get insurance, been unable to get certain healthcare treatments, been unable to get housing, because the entities that are giving away those things are divvying out those things use data analytics services like Lexis, Nexus, or Thomson Reuters, and there's bad data in their data dossiers, and they are not able to get services that they need. So I have a few examples right here that I'll share before we go to questions. But Lexis Nexus sells data to all sorts of law enforcement agencies. They have a $16 million contract with ICE right now. Thomson Reuters used to have the same contract. I think Lexis Nexus probably underbid Thomson Reuters to get the contract this year. So who knows, it might go back someday. They also provide personal data services to 70% of local governments and 80% of federal agencies in the United States. They sell data to landlords. This is an article from Texas about people who were unable to get housing because of errors in their LexisNexis data that made them look like risks. Healthcare systems use LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters services for their to streamline their healthcare services, but that also means that people sometimes are labeled as having certain types of healthcare problems, addictions, medical issues that maybe they don't actually have because the data is not super high quality. And sometimes people get the wrong kind of healthcare or are unable to get healthcare that they need as a result. A lot of times, like, kind of the last question that I get asked is, okay, what does this mean for our research data? Because I'm a librarian. We're not sure if there are like firewalls between their legal information platforms, their Elsevier platforms, and these data brokering services that they do. But there is evidence that the companies do install some policing software and kind of data collection software into their research platform. So Wolfie Crystal is somebody who researches this type of stuff on the back end. And he actually found that Science Direct, which is a major science research platform that Elsevier provides, embeds threat metrics, which is policing software, into Science Direct, and that software tracks you as you are doing academic research. So we're not sure what the contours of that are, and the companies are really opaque about it. So all I can say is, to where does your research data go, is I'm not sure. But all of your research data, everything you click on their walled garden platforms, is definitely stored. And it's my theory that they will use the data if they figure out how to. So the data that happens as you search around is likely never expunged, and it just kind of goes into like their dark data pools. It's warehoused away with other personal data. And if they ever figure out a way to monetize and sell our research data, I promise you they will do that. So that is the presentation. I'd love to take questions.
Let's thanks, Sarah. If you can only hear me clapping. Okay, we have a question in the chat from Paul. Paul asks, does the GDPR and friends protect us against the data collection? Can people request their Lex IDs and all associated data, or is that not feasible?
That is a great question. And yeah, so if you like live in California or, you know, live in an EU jurisdiction, you can request your data, and you may even have some power to correct your data. So generally these laws don't prevent data collection, but they do like require data brokers to register so you know who they are. And they require, like, I think Shay was able to get his Thomson Reuters file because he had some sort of affiliation with California that let him ask for it as somebody who was subject to CCPA. So yeah, those laws can be helpful if you live in the right place. And that's what's unfortunate. Like, some people have more data privacy and access rights than others because it's such a patchwork.
Great. Oh,
you know, my dog. And yeah, I'm happy to share my slides. That, I know that's not one of the major substantive questions, but I'm glad to share my slides. I'll hand them over.
Great. And of course, the video of the talk will go up pretty soon. Laura asks, even if part of the solution is to make our data and scholarly publishing more open, how can this stop these analytics from happening, or are there other solutions, things to consider?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I mean, one reason I like talking about this stuff is because I do think there are a lot of possible solutions, right? We don't have to live in this information ecosystem that these companies are creating. The first step is like for all of us to be aware that this is happening, right? So now we've done the first step. And I think open and kind of user and community controlled systems are a great idea, but that's also understanding that they're really expensive to establish, really expensive to maintain. Like, I think librarians, sometimes we do this thing where it's like, oh, we'll make our own repository, we'll make our own system, but that's a tall order. And oftentimes when we make a really great system, Relics or Thomson Reuters just swoops in and buys it, right? ProQuest Clarivate does that too. So I think community-based systems are a good idea. Like, in my dream world, yeah, that would be great, and it would be sustainable, and we'd all be able to do it. I think really, I mean, my biggest push is kind of breaking up these companies and not allowing one or two companies to own so much of our informational resources. But that would take the will of a government, right, to do that work. And I think without that, some of these kind of regulatory and legislative solutions are important. So there have been suggestions that we treat our critical information resources kind of like public systems, and maybe even force the for-profit enterprises to pay, to help support with their billions of dollars of profits that they make, right, to contribute some of that to some of these community systems and resources so that we can create more options. I mean, the main problem now is we have these huge monopolies, so we really don't have a lot of power, right? There's not much leverage.
Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time. So that's, thanks, Sarah, again. Yay. And now Sarah and students will move into the Sarah Meets with Students room and take it from there. Okay, thank you all for coming to the CrySP speaker series on privacy. Again, co-hosted by the Librarians and Archivists Association of the University of Waterloo, this episode. Thank you all.
Bye.